Welcome to Management TV. Today we are with William Ury from the Harvard Business School, a specialist in negotiation. Welcome, Bill. How are you?
It's a pleasure, Eduardo. Pleasure to be here.
Why don't you tell us when and how you started to study negotiations?
Well, about 30 years ago when I was in graduate school, I was actually studying anthropology, which is, the study of human behavior. And I was interested in conflict. And one of the best ways of handling conflict, of course, if you want to resolve it, is through negotiation. And so I got interested in negotiation. How do we solve the conflicts in the Middle East, to how do we deal with labor management conflicts and industrial disputes, to how do you deal with your neighbors and your roommates and your family? And negotiation really cuts across all those domains.
When did you write your first book?
Yeah, I wrote my first book 25 years ago. It came out 25 years ago, Getting to Yes, co-authored with Roger Fisher. And it was about, how do you get to yes? How do you cooperate? What's the dance that you dance together when you've got a difficulty or an issue or you want to reach agreement? How do you make a deal? What's the process? What are the steps? What are the dance steps?
What are they?
Well,
the key processes, the key steps to reach a yes.
Well, the key one to me, one of the key ones, is to start with yourself, because I think ourselves, we may be the biggest barrier to success in negotiation, because human beings were reaction machines, and when angry, you will make the best speech you will ever regret. And so, first thing is, I use the metaphor of go to the balcony, which is take a step back from the negotiation, take a step back from the situation, like go to a balcony overlooking the stage, to kind of keep your eyes on the prize, see what's important there, what do you really care about in the negotiation? Because that's what's so easy to lose sight of. Once you go to the balcony, then you step to the other person's side, you put yourself in their shoes, understand the way they see it, what's concerning them, what's driving them, try to understand them, because you're trying to influence them. Understand what your interests are, understand what their interests are, and then look for a solution that can meet both sides' interests.
What was your second book about?
Second book, well, probably the most frequent question I got about the first book was, oh yeah, but how do you get to yes if the other side says no? I mean, what if they're not interested in negotiation? What if they're not interested in cooperation? How do you deal with someone who's emotional or very rigid, refuses to even engage in negotiation? Or how do you deal with someone who uses dirty tricks? And so I wrote a book called Getting Past No.
What are the main messages there?
The main messages there were, again, like judo or jiu-jitsu, instead of attacking the other side, you step to the other person's side so that you can jointly attack the problem. And the main message there was building them a golden bridge. It comes from the Chinese military strategist, 5th century BC. He talked about building your opponent a golden bridge to retreat across. In negotiation, I would define it more positively as how do you build a golden bridge for them to advance across towards a mutually agreeable solution. In other words, how do you make it as easy as possible for the other side to say yes? Let me give you an example.
Yes.
Steven Spielberg, the filmmaker, when he was 15, his life was terrorized by a bully who was a couple years older than him, always beating him up, picking on him, making his life pure hell. He would run home from school dive under his bed, call out safe to himself. So one day he says, how do I get this bully off my back? How can I negotiate with him? So he goes up to the bully one day, he says, I'm making these little home movies. Even then he was making home movies. And he said, I'm making one about fighting the Nazis. And I was wondering if you'd like to play the war hero. Well, the bully at first laughs in his face, but a couple days later he comes back and kind of grudgingly says, okay. So young Spielberg takes him, makes him a war hero, dresses him up with a backpack and the full works. In the movie, he says after that movie, that little home movie, that bully became his best friend. His best friend in high school was the bully. How did he transform a bully into a best friend? How did he negotiate? He built him a golden bridge. He made it attractive for him to do what he wanted him to do. How? By putting himself in his shoes, understanding, why does a bully bully? What's the underlying motivation? What's the underlying interest? What is a bully bully? They want recognition, they want power, they want control. So he thought, what do I have in my control, in my resources, that I can do? Well, I can make him a war hero in my movie. By meeting his basic needs, he got the bully to actually come to his side.
Interesting. Have you applied the same principle in political negotiations or conflict resolutions?
Absolutely.
For example, can you share an anecdote?
Well, okay, an anecdote. Negotiating with Hugo Chavez. So, you know, I was involved in mediating between Hugo Chavez, President Hugo Chavez of Venezuela, and his political opposition. And you know, Chavez is a very strong character, very powerful man. And I remember at one point I went to see him. It was about 9 o'clock at night at his presidential palace. He kept me waiting. He had a cabinet meeting or something. I didn't get in until midnight. And I thought maybe it would be a one-on-one meeting with him, but in fact, his whole cabinet was arrayed behind him, and we were sitting, a little bit like you and I were sitting like this. And so we started making small talk, and I said, you know, that it seemed to me that things were getting a little bit better in the situation, the conflict situation. And he leaned into me, he said, what do you mean better? Things are getting much worse. Let me tell you what they're doing. And he got furious. I mean, he was just really, it was like he leaned in right to my face. And at least 30 minutes, maybe 40 minutes, maybe even an hour, he was, you know, shouting, you know, and I didn't know how much of it was designed to impress his ministers, how much of it was real and so on. But he was shouting, and, you know, he was saying, you neutrals, you're being fooled blind by the other side. And you know, of course, you feel like reacting, you feel like defending. But I realized, you know, going to the balcony, you know, it's not gonna advance the process for me to get into an argument with the president. So I just pinched the palm of my hand here, which is often a kind of technique of just staying alert and just not reacting. One of the greatest powers you have is not to react. And just let him finish. Yeah. And at the end of the 40 minutes, he finally heaved a sigh and said, so Ury, what should I do? Wow. And then, okay, so if you try to reason with someone who's in an angry state of mind, you can't get anywhere. But if you listen to them, if you actually hear them out, and listening is one of the key arts in negotiation, then they might come into a reasonable state of mind where they're finally ready to hear. And so I had a proposal to him about, let's have a cooling off period over Christmas time so that people could enjoy their Christmas and so on. And he was very friendly and said, why don't you come around the country with me, and so on. And so it was completely a transformation just by the power of not reacting, the power of listening.
Not answering to every one of his comments or complaints.
Right, just keeping your eyes on the prize. It's not easy to do, but you know, not getting defensive, and just keeping your eyes, what are we here for? We're not here for me to defend what I'm doing. We're here to see if we can advance the situation in Venezuela.
What else is it needed to continue a negotiation where you have very opposite interests, the two sides?
Yeah. Well, one thing you need to do is you really need to do a thorough analysis of the situation. What are your interests? Behind the positions, behind the things that people say they want, like the dollars and cents, the money and the terms, what are people's real concerns? And then try to find a creative solution. For example, there was a negotiation some years ago where a very successful ice cream company in the United States was being bought by a big multinational. And the lawyers and the investment bankers were all there in New York, and they were settling the deals. And they got stuck. There was an impasse because the owner of the ice cream company was a very successful businessman who built this ice cream company from scratch. Wanted 10% more for his company, then the other side was really willing to pay, and they'd gone as far as they could, and it just seemed like, okay, you know, the deal's off. And then the vice president of the multinational company, which was a European company, kind of, instead of giving up, he went over to one of the negotiators on the other side. He said, tell me, I don't understand. I really don't understand. We've looked at all the, you know, the ways of pricing a business and so on, and we think we've made a very generous offer here. Why the 10% bonus? What's that 10%? And the negotiator explained, well, the owner of the company, selling his company, he's wondering what I'm going to do. He was still a relatively young man, and he wanted to know what he was going to do in his life. And his legacy, his genuine interest was the world environment, and he wanted to set up a foundation to help the world environment. And he needed that 10% to set up the foundation. Well, once that interest was identified, then it was a totally different negotiation, because the multinational said, you know what? We're also having to be very concerned now about the environment. It's a big issue for all companies. We have to be socially responsible. And we're in the process of setting up a global environmental foundation that will actually have more money in it, because we're a huge company, than even that 10%. They invited the owner of the ice cream company to be the chairman of their foundation, and that night they signed the deal.
How can you say, let's forget the past?
Right.
Is it possible to say, let's forget the past?
I don't think it's possible to really forget the past, but it's possible to begin to forgive the past.
Okay.
And you know, people want to remember things that happened, if someone died and so on. It's hard for people to put the past totally to rest. But the only way to do it that I know of, a simple human mechanism, is acknowledgement, recognition of what happened, bringing out the truth, the facts, giving people a chance to air what happened, to tell their stories, and then giving them a chance to be compensated, to talk about it. And then in that context, maybe they can begin to let go a little bit, to forgive, to accept, so that they can move on with their lives, so they can move from a focus just on the past to a focus on the future. And you bring up Ireland. I mean, I've been watching that conflict and been involved a little bit over the last 30 years. And what's amazing is this last month this was a conflict that people said was going to go on forever, it was the worst, and Catholics and Protestants would be killing each other forever. The children were imbibing that hatred in their mother's milk and so on. And this last month, you had the unprecedented thing of the Catholic and Protestant leaders. You had a very vitriolic Protestant leader, the Reverend Ian Paisley, sit down with Martin McGuinness, who was the reputed head of the IRA, which was labeled a terrorist organization, and they're working together in the same government. They were smiling and shaking hands. So if those two can work together, you know, anyone can. So it takes time, it takes patience, but the key to it is negotiation.
Another incredible example for me is South Africa. Mm-hmm. How from apartheid one would think there will be generations of revenge and coming back, and nothing of that happened.
Right.
Why do you think South Africa, Nelson Mandela, was so successful in avoiding that conflict?
Well, it takes real leadership. It took leadership on both sides, but Nelson Mandela in particular was, you know, he realized, look, we want to deal with the past. They set up something called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was headed up by Archbishop Tutu to basically do what I was just saying. Actually listen to the stories, take testimony. It was televised, give everyone a chance to tell their story, so that you don't forget the past. You actually deal with the past, but then it gives them a chance to move on with their lives. But they have a concept in Africa called Ubuntu, which is the spirit of Ubuntu, which is, you know, I exist because we exist. In other words, a sense of independence. And so there's a sense in which there's a spirit of reconciliation that he tapped into. Now, it was difficult because, you know, apartheid left lots of scars. There were a lot of deaths, there was a lot of violence, there was a lot of oppression, and they're still dealing with it. But it's quite amazing that here's this, you know, South Africa to me is an inspiration to us all of a situation which was thought to be impossible, would be civil war forever, and through patient, persistent negotiation by leaders like Nelson Mandela and his counterpart Frederick de Klerk, and the whole society. It wasn't just at the top leadership level, but it was the leaders, a lot of business leaders got involved, a lot of religious leaders, a lot of civil society leaders, youth leaders. The whole society engaged in a process and was able to transform that situation.
You've participated in many international negotiations. Which country or government would you say have been models of negotiation, very professional, very inspiring?
Well, I mean, we just named one, you know.
Okay, in addition to?
Maybe South Africa. You know, another one is Malaysia, let's say. Take another country from, because it's interesting, you know, 50 years ago, if you'd looked at Malaysia, say, and Sri Lanka, say, and you said, which country is most likely to have conflict, ethnic tensions, ethnic war, you would have definitely said Malaysia, because there was a war there, a civil war between the Malays, the ethnic Malays, and the Chinese, for example, back in the 50s. And yet, Malaysia today was able to craft a political system in which all the ethnic groups are represented, are valued, there's a sense of respect between them, and Malaysia's gone on to be a powerhouse, an economic powerhouse, whereas Sri Lanka got locked into a terrible civil war that's still going on. So Malaysia, to me, is another example. It's not perfect, but it's an example of where they use negotiation to. I mean, the whole idea of negotiation is, instead of getting into a cycle where each side tries to win at the other expense, you know, win-lose, which ends up in an outcome where all sides lose. They said, how can we all win? How can there be enough on the table for everyone? So instead of just kind of quarreling about dividing up the pie, how do we expand the pie before we divide it up? And that's what they've done in Malaysia.
Let's go from government to children.
Right.
One of my toughest negotiations have been with my own children. Probably they use love and hate.
Right.
They blackmail you in a certain extent. They can manipulate you eventually. You know, 2-year-old kids are famous for
right.
that.
Sure.
But why do you think it's so tough to negotiate with children?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of emotions involved, because we were once children, and we bring back all those things from our parents and the way that our parents saw us or treated us. Plus, we start to get so identified with the child that we see the child as almost like an extension of ourselves. So the child's behavior we take very personally. It's harder for us to go to the balcony with a child.
Okay.
It's easier maybe with a business colleague than it is with a family member. In fact, the interesting thing is, the more internal the conflicts, like within the family, the more difficult. And if you superimpose, for example, an internal family conflict inside a business, those are some of the most difficult business disputes, between siblings and
the
parents.
Family business experience.
The family business experience, exactly.
That leads me to my next question was, personally, which was your most difficult negotiation that you can share, at least?
Yeah, well, aside from family negotiations, family negotiations can be tough, but just professionally, I mean, one of the most difficult ones was being involved for some years, as I was, between the government of Russia and the government of Chechnya in a time in the 90s, to try to bring an end to what was the first Chechen civil war, and then to try to prevent, unsuccessfully, what became the second Chechen war. And I was working at a very high level. I was working at the top levels of the Chechen society and the top levels of Russia. And it was really challenging. I remember one negotiation, one meeting where we were meeting the first time outside of Russia. We were meeting in The Hague in Holland. And the Chechen delegation coming from their capital of Grozny took off in their plane, and they were flying over Russian airspace, which was, of course, part of, that was, was all part of, and suddenly they're surrounded by these Russian MiGs that said, you don't have authorization to take off, and they threatened to shoot them down, so they forced them to land. And then by the time they got to
That's a good start,
The Hague,
huh?
yeah, start. You know, we were meeting in the room where the Yugoslav War Crimes Tribunal was taking place in the Peace Palace there. You know, where the tribunal was taking place. We were using that same room, and the Chechen vice president began the conversation by pointing to the Russians and saying, "You better stay right in these same seats because you're going to be on trial for war crimes in Chechnya." And so that's how, you know, those were tough negotiations.
Why did they fail?
They failed. They could have succeeded. They failed, I think, in large part because one of the key factors to me in a conflict is the responsibility of the surrounding community, the surrounding world community, to come in and assist. It's very hard for the two sides alone to reach an agreement without a third side, without the community. And in this case, the larger community, the Europeans, the Americans, the United Nations, you know, during those years, those truce years in Chechnya, there were no jobs. All the young men were out of work. You know, the only thing they knew from the first war was, you know, how to fire a gun and engage in kind of criminal activity. And so they descended into that, and that escalated into the Second Chechen War. So it was a real missed opportunity. And for me, the lesson that humanity needs to learn is just like we're moving in medicine from just, you know, heart surgery to preventive medicine, you know, exercise and diet and the right things. We need to do the same thing with conflicts. We can actually anticipate, we can predict conflicts, and we can prevent them. And they're much easier prevented than they are dealt with when the blood is flowing.
You talk about the jobs in Chechnya, and last week a politician told me, you know why? I think the Irish conflict was resolved because of the economic growth they had over the last years.
Yeah.
When you have poverty, everything.
It's true. It's true. In fact, you know, there
Iraq,
was
Palestine, maybe there's some to it too.
Exactly. No, and in fact, in Northern Ireland, you know, Europe as the third side, as the container, allowed that conflict to resolve. And I think the same thing is true with Palestine, Israel, Iraq. What's needed in that area is prosperity. And in fact, I'm working on a project right now precisely to kind of learn the lessons of Europe, which is if you analyze that region, its largest potential growth sector actually is tourism. You know, the choice is terrorism or tourism. And because there are 3 billion people on the planet who are children of Abraham, who'd like to visit the Holy Land and want to go back to their roots. And tourism, as we've seen in Spain and in Italy and in France, you know, around the world, is the greatest potential economic engine in the rural countryside to allow villages to develop with respectful jobs and so on. And so if we can begin to do that, so that what we're working on is, do you know the Camino de Compostela? Is to create a kind of Camino de Compostela in the Middle East that retraces the footsteps of Abraham, goes through all those countries from Iraq to Jordan, Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, all the countries he went through as a historic route like Compostela to begin to bring prosperity and to remind people that it's a family dispute, you know, in the family of Abraham.
You have just finished another book. What's the particularity of this latest book?
Well, you know, after giving so much attention to yes and the process of getting to yes, I decided I needed to, you know, go to the other side of the coin, go to the other side for a moment and do some justice to the word no. Because the word no is probably the most, it's probably the greatest challenge that we face today in the information age is saying no, because there's so much going on, there's so much to choose from, you know, our inboxes are full. In order to say yes to our true priorities, whether that's as individuals or as organizations and companies, for example, we need to say no to lots of other things. I remember early on, just after I wrote Getting to Yes, I was working on U.S.-Soviet relations, and my first funder was Warren Buffett, the celebrated investor. And he came, you know, we had breakfast together, and he said to me, you know, Bill, I don't understand all this yes stuff. He said, this getting to yes stuff. For me, the most important word is no. He says, as I sit there at my desk there in Omaha, and I look at one investment proposal after another, and I say, no, not that one, no, not that one, no, not that one. I say no maybe 1,000 times until I see exactly what I want, and then I say yes. And all I have to do is say yes 4 or 5 times in my life, and I'm a billionaire. And the principle there, the insight there, is that in order to, it's not about just about getting to yes, it's about getting to the right yes. And in order to getting to the right yes, you have to say no a lot. But no is also potentially a very destructive word. It can destroy relationships. It's very hard for people to say. And so I wrote a book about how to say no positively, in a way that comes from a strong yes inside you, a strong positive set of values, and goes towards positive results, ends up in an agreement. You say no in order to get to yes, and that's what the book's about.
Okay. When you look to the next 5 or 10 years, the field of negotiation, where is research going on that can change the field altogether? Is it in biosciences, psychology? Will it change, or you think that these principles will apply for the next 200 years?
Well, I think the principles are basically, they're kind of universal principles. But I think you mentioned biosciences. One of the interesting things is, marrying neurobiology with negotiation and looking, for example, going to the balcony. What is that neurobiologically? The limbic system, for example, controls our emotions. It's about going from the limbic system to the prefrontal cortex. That's going to the balcony, essentially, giving a neurobiological basis to negotiation, and understanding that, I think, will be critical. I think understanding, for example, how negotiation takes place in a world dominated by the internet, for example, with email. I mean, how does that shift? Because so many communications are now electronic, or they're virtual. How's that going to take place? I think that will definitely affect the world of negotiation.
Do you have a clue on how will that affect?
Well, one of the things, for example, I've noticed, for example, in email, there's a tendency, again, dealing with the balcony for a moment, you get a message that you don't like or something, and you immediately compose a response, and there's a temptation is you hit the reply key. It used to be you send a letter or something, you could get the letter out of the mailbox. You just instantly hit that reply key, or what's worse, you hit reply all,
yes,
and it goes to the whole organization or all your friends, and then conflicts escalate. And the balcony button is, the most important button on the screen is save as draft. In other words, write it, save it as a draft, think about it, sleep on it, come back the next day, and think about it. So I think those are some trends that I think are well worth. Cross-cultural negotiation, more and more negotiations are cross-cultural, cross boundaries of all kinds. How do we negotiate those boundaries is another edge in the negotiation field today.
If you tie the past and your current work and what you comment on the future, are you planning to write a new book, and what would that be on?
Yeah, well, I'm just taking notes. I'm just taking notes, and what I'm trying to understand, it goes back to what we were talking about before. I'm trying to understand the negotiation field in the context of what's its evolutionary function. What's its function in human social evolution? There's a way in which it's actually a journey where you're going from me and thinking about myself to thinking about we and as a team or an organization, and it's kind of this process of conflict and cooperation that's mixed, that's negotiation, and I'm interested in trying to understand how all fits together.
Because it seems that we are wired from one type of reactions that made sense in a given environment, but we need to readapt, train to a totally different world.
Totally different world.
Thank you very much for your comments, and hope to see you soon.
My pleasure. Good luck in your negotiations.
Thank you very much.